pondering what to talk about tonight, as I do, and have to go into free association mode and think about what's going on and how many times can I talk about birds. I'm having a riot on my hand with people saying enough of birds. And the thing that popped up in my head is water and water shortage and evaporation and what's going on currently. So one of the things that was on my mind is this general idea of our salt marshes and how important they are and how salinity determines what's going on in our salt marshes. And we all know, of course, Port Royal Sound is so unique because it doesn't have much freshwater input. It's really salt water sloshing in and out of the sound. And that's why it's really salty out here. It's not full ocean strength, but it's pretty close. And that leads to the question of where is it saltiest around here? If you were to walk out by Shrimp Pond and say, where is it saltiest? It's not in Shrimp Pond because there is some freshwater input coming from the Green Tree Reservoir on Shrimp Pond Road. And then you might say, well, it's got to be in the water itself, right? Well, actually it's not. It's in the soil. But which part of the soil? If you tested the salinity of the soil at the low tide and the high tide lines, they're about the same because it's just salt kind of seeping into the soil there. But then you go just above the high tide line and you've got the rare high tides and the storm surges that slosh into those higher points and they leave salt water, but then there's no more input for weeks or months. But then you've got the sun shining on it and water evaporates and the salt gets left behind. So you actually knew this without knowing it. Because as you drive around, you think about where do I have bare soil in the salt marsh? And it's those high upper ends of the salt marsh just before you hit the black needle rush and other taller vegetation. And if you walk out in the middle of that, there's little succulent plants, right? There's the pickleweed and those things that can live in that stuff. So they've adapted to that really high bit of salt, which is pretty amazing. So that's it. So we've got normal salt flow, and then we have high evaporation, and then you've got a year like this where we don't have much rain coming in. So the soil starts changing around it, and we're starting to see this. My commute in has more dead pines than I saw in the previous couple of years. Think about the groundwater in an island surrounded by salty areas. If we don't have much rain, suddenly you start having salt creeping in and that damages the trees. So we're seeing kind of impacts around there. But if none of that registers and you're like, I just want to see what Andy's talking about with evaporation and heat and dryness, go to Tree Frog Pond. Has anybody driven past Tree Frog Pond on the south end of the island recently? It's almost all soil exposed. It has essentially dried up completely. We're in a drought cycle for sure. And what is going to happen to that pond? Well, thank goodness for adaptation. Plants are adapted to this because water levels have varied for billions of years. And aquatic plants deal with this by having seeds that last a really long time. So it's kind of dramatic what you see. The birds are in picking at things and getting all of the struggling fish and amphibians, but it will come back. The plant life will come back, the fish life, the amphibians will come back, but it's just kind of a set of extremes that are going on right now. But please, as you see these things around here, take some photos and share them with us. We've got interesting shifts in water levels and so forth. Okay, well that's the end of my lecture. So I'm really pleased to turn it over to our speaker tonight. So Dr. Andrew Bridges is the CEO and president of Nemours Wildlife Foundation. Andrew started there in 2022. So he's been there for 4 years at this point. And I've enjoyed working with him because I started here in 2022 as well. And so we clicked pretty early on, and there's some collaborations between our organizations that he's going to talk about tonight. Andrew's an Alabama native and is a very skilled wildlife ecologist. His history includes working with fish. His bachelor's was at the University of Florida. He's worked with quail for his master's at Texas A&M. And he's worked on black bear for his PhD at Virginia Tech. I think one of the interesting steps in his history is that he was a welder fellow. And this was a fellowship that involved living on the land where you're actually doing the research, which set him up for Nemours very nicely, where he's living at Nemours and has a staff that are doing incredible work there as well. One of the things I appreciate about Andrew is he's a very broad thinker in conservation. He's trying to think about how do organizations reach their maximum capacity. And he's doing some really interesting work at Nemours that I'm just going to turn it over to him to talk about. So let's welcome Dr. Andrew Bridges.
There we go. All right. Can y'all hear me all right?
Yeah.
Good deal. All right. Well, thank you all so much for having me here today. I am honored to be with you all, and as Andy mentioned, the relationship with Spring Island and Nemours is something that I think very highly of and treasure very much. So I'm going to start off with that, and then I'll get into a little bit about Nemours, and then we'll get to the focal point of our topic for the day. So one thing that I've appreciated is I looked at our respective mission statements, that when you kind of compare them side by side, you start to see a lot of the same terms. I've got a few of these highlighted here, but that the scope of what we're trying to do is, beyond where we are, that we're also working in science, we're also working in education. And similar, really in a lot of ways, I think very similar missions, and the Spring Island Trust has been a long-standing partner for Nemours prior to my tenure here. Both Andy and I's predecessors worked together well, and we're good friends, and I think this relationship goes back a long time, and I'm excited to continue that with Andy. One of the things that we started shortly after I arrived, that Andy and I worked on together along with Tony Mills, who's I'm sure near and dear to everyone's heart here, was the establishment of what we call the Coastal Kids Program. This is really one of, I think, the most innovative and exciting conservation education programs that is in existence. It is truly hands-on, as you can see from this photograph. The kids that we're working with, and this is the mission statement for this collaborative, are getting dirty, they're getting muddy, they're actually getting out in the woods. This isn't your typical summer camp. This is teaching kids to be scientists. Tony calls it, I love the phrase he's used, which is teachable adventures. You're giving kids an adventure and ownership of these experiences. And that's a little different. And most of the ones are a little more keep your distance and we'll tell you what to do. This is more engage and be part of the process, which is why we have these small cohorts and this really heavy involvement. But the things that you start to see, this is one of the photographs from Spring Island with the kids out with their little quadrants where they're measuring things in the marsh. You can really start to see they're becoming little scientists. We started working with the Penn Center on this as well. That's been very rewarding, getting kids from underserved communities, from St. Helena Island, engaged. They've been coming out and working with us on these programs. And you can just see the lights turning on. The little girl in this picture, actually, when she started, she said she was terrified of snakes. And by the end of the day, she said, I want to hold the biggest snake that we have. And this is a photograph from Nemours. We alternate and we go back and forth. We do some of the sessions here, we do some of the sessions at Nemours. But how many kids get to hold a cowbird in their hands and get to see that up close and do banding and how to age birds and all of these things. And just the sheer joy that you see of these kids when the light clicks on. I mean, you can't, that picture, a picture's worth 1,000 words. I think that's worth 1,000,000 words. That kid's life's changed, and that's one of the things that we're hoping to be able to do through this program. You can see our little cohort here. This is one of our most recent cohorts, but once again, just the sheer joy on everyone's face and the adventure. We're out in the rain, we're out there in the mosquitoes and the bugs, and we're getting out there, we're getting dirty, we're being little scientists. So that was, I think that's part of our relationship, and I think something that we're very proud of. We're about to launch the next cohort here in June, so looking forward to the next round of that. We're looking forward to building on that and growing it some more. So the photograph you see in front of you is Eugene DuPont III and his wife Laura. They were the founders of Nemours. We'll now transition to a little bit of the Nemours piece. So Mr. DuPont amassed a large tract of land over the course of his life, and at the end of his life, he left it as a wildlife foundation. And this is where we are. So who's been to Nemours, just out of curiosity, show of hands? All right, so about half, it looks like about half the audience, which is good. Sometimes I do these presentations, and it's surprising how many people have never heard of us or certainly never been out there. So I'm glad to see that most of you all have been there. But if you've ever driven by, just to orient you a little bit, right there, that's actually 21. This is Garden's Corner, kind of under our corner there. And this is the Harriet Tubman Bridge. So we're basically the whole track that connects from the Harriet Tubman Bridge to Highway 21. It's about 10,000 acres in total. And wetlands are certainly what we're known for. Wetlands are a primary component. The historic rice fields are, I think, the signature piece of the Lowcountry. I could do a whole talk on just the rice fields and all of those things. It's the cultural history piece and how that nexus is with conservation is, I think, particularly profound in this part of the world. But we also have a lot of woodlands, and so most of our focus historically had been more on the wetlands. But we also have a lot of woodlands, and we also have a lot of fields. Not as many, but some fields. And so we work around a concept, and this is to not restate the vision, the mission statement, but this is kind of an encapsulation of philosophically what we're trying to achieve here. This is a photograph actually from the Coastal Kids program. That's Catherine Madden, who's Tony's wife, if you've never met her. Maybe the nicest person on the planet. So the concept that we're trying to work around is that, and some of this is established, we've actually added a piece. I used to work in strategic planning, and so I added a piece of this to the model that's a little bit different. But the general idea that nature conservation creates ecosystem services. So what's an ecosystem service? These are the things that functional and intact ecosystems, I'm reciting the definition now. Functional and intact ecosystems provide to people. That could be economic well-being, that could be spiritual well-being of how it feels to be in the woods, that could be birding opportunities, fishing opportunities, things of that nature. So these are all things that a good ecosystem provides to people. And then that enhances human well-being. It allows you to make a livelihood. It allows you to live a deeper and richer life. The Coastal Kids program is much about getting kids that may not have had that connection, that are glued to their phones and their devices, as people are so much these days, to form that connection and have that sense of well-being at the end of it and recognize those things. The piece we've added in, which is not in most of the models you would see if you were looking in textbooks, is what I call societal services. So this is the response of the people that are now connected. This can be adults, it's not just kids, this is everyone. When you understand those two linkages, which is what we're trying to teach and trying to provide at Nemours, that society will then support conservation. They will vote with things that promote conservation. They'll make decisions at the grocery store. They will philanthropically support it. Some of them might actually become little conservation biologists or change their careers. And then that creates the wonderful feedback loop, the virtuous cycle. And that's what we're trying to create philosophically at Nemours. Who loves old maps? Me too. I love old maps. So when we were thinking about what we wanted to do as the next chapter at Nemours, we were focusing a little bit on the uplands because we'd done a lot of work in the wetlands, and that was something that we wanted to obviously continue to emphasize. But how do we do work in the uplands? So we go back and we look at old maps, and we think about what the landscape looked like historically, what we might actually want to try to get back to if we could recreate some of that. This is an old map of the Carolinas. I love looking at these things. It was actually kind of a fun exercise. There'll be a piece of this, of a discovery I made while I was doing all of this work. But one of the things that you start to notice as you zoom in on these old maps is something called the Grand Savanne. So, and this was a consistent theme in these maps from the 1700s. Again, consistent. You see this across multiple maps. So a lot of the southeast was in longleaf pine, historically. These big savanna ecosystems that were governed by a couple of factors, fire and large grazers. A lot of folks don't realize we have large grazers here. We're missing it's hard to imagine the landscape as it was historically, but the large grazers, the bison, the elk, a lot of the large suites of predators are gone now. But these savannas were the result of fire and then the grazing herds of ungulates that moved along underneath and followed those fires and ate that grass. Those fires were lit by either lightning strikes or by Native Americans, but this was very much the ecosystem of the Southeast. Longleaf pine, just as a sidebar, there's about 98% of that, of the historic longleaf pine is gone now. So these savanna ecosystems are largely gone. And again, we now try to recreate these things. So we go and we do prescribed fire, and I'm sure you guys have seen these on Spring Island. It's certainly a big part of what we do at the moors. It's an important part of trying to maintain the ecosystem in a state that was similar to what it was historically. However, when you have a prescribed fire that gets away, or if you have an area that has not been burned frequently enough and you try to burn it or it gets away into that area, you end up with scenes like this. And you start to get headlines like this. These are all little snippets from different journal articles and news stories, but these fires can get away, they can cause problems. There's issues with smoke, there's issues with how much particulates we're putting into the air, and certainly there's liability concerns. It's expensive to burn. So fire is an important tool, and one that we're not trying to put away by any stretch, but at the same time it's one that is fraught in a lot of ways, and being able to return the ecosystem to being fire managed is challenging. At the same time, so we think about what drives land conservation and also ecosystem management in this region. A lot of this comes down to forestry. You know, we are a very forested ecosystem now, and I'll talk more about kind of how that unfolded and some of the challenges with that. But one of the things that we run into in this part of the world now is that the timber industry is encountering a lot of challenges. That's a little bit of a longer story about why that's happening. But some of the headlines you start to see is things like this, that we're losing revenue around timber. We're having a harder and harder time managing timber. And at the same time, what that means is we can't create these savanna-type ecosystems that we want to go back to, hopefully. And also, we run into issues where people can't raise enough money to produce conservation or even to conserve the land. The surest way to lose a tract to development or whatever that might be is to have someone not able to pay property taxes. So if we lose this mechanism, which we are losing right now, we've lost a significant wildlife management tool. We've also lost a significant land management tool. A wall of wood. This is an actual quote from the Wall Street Journal. So what's happened? Why do we have this issue? And again, I'll only touch on pieces of this because it's a very complicated issue. But this is a graph of the amount of planted pine in the Southeast. You can see starting in 1950, we had a couple of million acres. You notice that about 1980, there's a big spike, and then it starts to somewhat level out, but continue to increase. That was a CRP program kicked in and incentivized people to plant their fields and their agricultural ag spaces with loblolly, which is why you see this incredible increase. But that was converting a lot of open fields, a lot of rough edges into loblolly plantations, which generally speaking, foresters that have a love of loblolly are here right now. But generally speaking, this is not great habitat for much, particularly through most of its life cycle. When it gets older, you can thin it and turn it into something, but through most of its life cycle, this is really kind of a desert for most species of wildlife. To give you some sense of what we're talking about here, I know this is one of those things that's always hard to imagine what we're talking about with 38 million acres of loblolly, which is what we have in the landscape right now. We are currently in the middle phase there. So an area roughly the size of the state of Alabama, my home state, is now planted in loblolly pine in the southeast. And in a few years, we'll be hitting closer to the size of Kansas. So this is a huge area that has been converted into these rotational loblolly stands that are generally not good wildlife habitat. And again, this has affected people. Thousands of Southerners planted trees for retirement and it didn't work. So you've got people that are losing their land, that are selling out of their land because this promise that was made that this would all pay off in the long run has largely not borne out. Pulpwood right now is $4 a ton, just to give you some sense. A ton, $4 for a ton of pulpwood in this part of the world. A few years ago, 20 years ago, that was $12 to $15 a ton, and when you count for inflation, you think about what the math is on that. It's been almost completely devalued. And again, I was talking about these rough edges. So these are the areas that a lot of wildlife would have used. These little small farms that might have had a little set of row crops there, different types of crops. And you might have had some chickens, you might have had some cows, which will dovetail into the rest of the talk. All of this being vastly superior wildlife habitat to loblolly thickets. So, at the same time, as we're doing all this, we're also losing small farms. You know, this is a big part of what makes America America, the sense of ownership and self-worth, and that comes with being a small farmer. I think that's about as all American as it gets. But those are disappearing as well. As we look across this, we continue to lose farms. Farms continue to consolidate and be converted into pine plantations. Here's a graph of small family farms in South Carolina. They are obviously decreasing significantly. These are being either developed or conglomerated or sold into subdivisions. At the same time, as we're now gradually pivoting into cattle, cattle are also disappearing from our landscape. At the same time, where is it going? Where is all this land going? Some of it's going to loblolly. A lot of it in South Carolina is going into housing. So anything that is paved over is certainly not going to be optimal wildlife habitat. So we're seeing these type of trends. And then we see things like this. So thinking about all these things in conjunction, we're losing land to development. We're converting grassland ecosystems that were historically these big savannas, and also that were then at least somewhat functional as small family farms, and we're losing songbirds. This is one of the examples of that. As you can see here, we've lost 53% of songbirds out of 2017. I'm sure that number is probably higher now. I'll talk a little bit about quail. So quail I always use as kind of a flagship species because they are grassland, open, understory type of birds, but they're also just indicators of that same ecosystem that we're talking about. They're also economic drivers, so they also have a piece of this that we're talking about, the incentive to maintain land and manage habitat. So quail are really kind of a canary in the coal mine, a quail in the coal mine of the whole system and how it's functioning. And if any of you are quail people at all out here, you probably know that wild quail in the southeast have declined precipitously. This is a graph of the cock calls. This is essentially the vocalizations the males make in the spring. And again, you can see this steep decline. If we put these all next to each other, you can see housing's up, loblolly's up, small family farms, quail, cattle are down. Correlation does not always equal causation, but in this case, I think there's certainly a link between all of these things. All right. So that leads us to this gentleman. Who knows who this is? Andy, you don't count. Aldo Leopold, exactly. So this gentleman is considered to be the father of wildlife management. He was the first professor of wildlife management in the country. He at University of Wisconsin. If you've never read any of his books, I definitely recommend him. I actually gave a talk, I don't know if any of y'all were there at the library the other day, about Santa County Almanac, which is more of his philosophy series of essays. But he also wrote a book called Game Management in 1933. And in that book, he made the following statement. The central thesis of game management is this. Game can be restored by the creative use of the same tools which have heretofore destroyed it. Axe, plow, cow, fire, and gun. So you think about where he was in time. He had just come out of the great exploitation period, the late 1800s, early 1900s, were when wildlife was almost wiped out across the country. The deer were gone, turkeys were gone, bears were gone. Almost all of those things were almost extinct, which is hard to wrap your head around. And we still lost a lot of things that were kind of passenger pigeons disappeared at that same time. He was at the tail end of all that. So he saw all these things, and recognized that these were the things that destroyed. The whole eastern seaboard had been clear cut. Basically everything on the east coast had been clear cut, including all the longleaf. He saw all of that, but he also recognized, which is part of why he was a visionary, that you could take those same tools, apply them properly, and you could use them to conserve wildlife. And so we looked at this and thought about the things that we're working in. And the one that was missing was the cow. And that leads us to the beginning of our conversation on cattle. So we are looking at this landscape thinking, well, we've got fire. That's one of the things that was missing. That's an important thing, but it's also somewhat fraught. We're also thinking we need revenue streams for folks because we want to incentivize land conservation. We want people to conserve pieces of land. We want tools so they can use that will improve wildlife habitat. We also have we'll get into all the different pieces of this. But we also want to replace the big, large grazing ungulates that were part of this landscape historically. What is the tool that we could use to do all of those things? And cattle were the tool that we came to. And I'll talk to you, the rest of the talk will be more about the nuts and bolts of how we came to that and also what that is intended to do. But we also then looked at models around the world for doing this. This is rewilding Europe. So what you're looking at right there is actually an attempt in Europe to backbreed domestic cows to their primal origin, what's called an auroch, which was the actual animal that became domestic cows. And they have recreated these genetically and are now releasing them onto the landscape throughout Europe. There's another term out there as we were exploring this concept called silvopasture, and this is the intersection of grazing and forestry. There's certainly elements of that we want to include, as well as the rewilding concept, again replacing those native grazers. How do we integrate forestry with grazing? How do those two work together? That's the concept of silvopasture. One of my favorite terms is pirate herbivory. This one is it's kind of a fun one. But that's the intersection of fire and grazing. How does fire and grazing interact with one another? Obviously elements of that we want to incorporate. And then conservation grazing. So this is how you use cows to do things like remove invasive species and things of that nature. Again, grazers and ungulates that would have been part of this landscape. But none of these actually quite fit. We wanted pieces of all of them, but not exactly any of those models distinctly. Which is how we came up with what we called the Eco-Pasture Initiative. And the idea is that this is a full ecological response that we're looking to produce, as well as an economic response. And when I talk about ecology, I include people in that. They're part of the ecosystem. So the ecology, the circle that we talked about earlier, includes people. And that's a very important part of that circle. All right, so we launched the Eco-Pasture Initiative. So we now got a concept that we want to work around. Where do we want to do it? So this was the very beginning phases of looking at our map of open moors. We'd spent quite a bit of time figuring out where the right spot was. So we broke it out between hardwood bottom and also longleaf pine, again trying to restore that longleaf pine ecosystem. We built fences, hard fences around the outside. We needed to add a couple of wells to get our animals watered, and then we set this up. We've actually now this map was our original map. We started this 2 years ago, almost exactly 2 years ago. We've now expanded down into the south, so we're now up to about 380 acres. It's about what we've got fenced in right now. We plan to take this further. Next question was, now that we figured out where we want to do it, what is the right breed of cattle? I am not a cattleman, so this took a lot of research to understand the nuances of all the different breeds and all the different pros and cons of them. But again, this is another opportunity when you look back at these old maps to look back at history and think about what might work best on our landscape. And so, we came to what is called the Piney Woods cow. Does anybody know anything about Piney Woods cows? We got one Piney Woods cow person. That's good. Okay, so Piney Woods cows, and I can talk about just this for forever. It was very exciting. We kind of hit on this concept. The idea of using Piney Woods cows really changed our paradigm, I think, significantly. These cattle were originally brought over by the Spaniards in the 1500s. So part of what I didn't realize as not being a cattleman, or I guess apparently a very good historian, was that part of the European colonization process was bringing livestock with them. So they did that everywhere they went. I was just reading a book about Captain Cook when he sailed around to Hawaii, and he brought cattle with him. And I trying to imagine, a galleon full of cattle going around Tierra del Fuego and what that must have been like. But apparently they do such things, and they did such things. So they brought cattle with them, and they dropped them off. And in Florida, they evolved into what we call cracker cows now. In the southeast, they became piney woods cows because they lived in the piney woods. In Texas, they became longhorns. They're a little different. So these are what we would call a landrace breed, which means they've never been bred for any particular trait. The Longhorns are a heritage breed. They're related, but they've been bred for the horns. So they've actually been selectively bred for the giant horn. So there's a little difference there. There was another one in California that the gold miners ate, and they're now extinct. So anyway, they've now been on the landscape, and they were basically turned loose into the countryside to find their own way. And because of that, they've evolved now on this landscape for 500 years. 500 years of evolution to select for these animals that work well in this ecosystem. And that will play a role in what we're talking about a little bit later. But they were used as draft animals. As you can see here, they were actually used to pull out some of the longleaf that they lived in. They were used as meat animals, as milk, dairy producers. They were just a general draft animal. One of the wonderful things about them, they eat everything because they are evolved to be here. They don't just eat grass. They certainly don't eat corn unless offered. But actually, this picture, I was doing a presentation last year, and the morning of the presentation, I thought, I'm going to stop by and see if I can get a picture of one of them eating something weird. And the first one I came up to was this, eating with a big wad of Spanish moss hanging out of his mouth, just right on cue. So you also think, well, they're wild animals that have been out in the landscape forever. They're wild and hard to handle. They're not. They're actually extremely docile. They're very easy to work with. They're actually just lovely animals. One of the things I also like to tell folks is they're anatomically correct. They can produce live birth on their own. You don't have to pull calves. Again, that would have been pulled out a long time ago. They're not big beef production machines. They're actually functioning as wild ungulates on the landscape. And they've been here a long time. This is what I referenced earlier about going back and looking at old maps. As I was actually flipping through the old maps for the Grand Savan thing, I came across this, and something caught my eye. This is a drawing that was made in the early 1700s, sort of traditional Native American scene. It's got the forge and the smoke and all the kind of usual elements. Zoom in on this a little bit. These piney woods cows were already part of that system, of that culture, when this was drawn in the early 1700s. So they've been part of this landscape again for a very, very, very long time. So we went and located some piney woods cows. We got very fortunate to find an older gentleman who had a herd that he was willing to sell some of. And this was almost exactly 2 years ago. It was April 2024 when we released our first herd of 14 animals onto the landscape. You'll notice that in this picture, the collar that's hanging from the neck right there, that was another piece that we wanted to build into this. We are doing wildlife research here, and so we needed to be able to track their movements. This is a new technology that's, there are now quite a few variants of it. It's becoming more popular. But what it lets you do, through these towers, this one's a tower system. There's some now that don't even use towers. This was installing the tower. But it lets you actually track where they are on the landscape. You can produce heat maps, if you remember what those are, color-coded things that show how they're using the landscape. An important piece for us is also that we're in a forest. So if a hurricane comes through and trees fall on our fences, you can actually set up a digital fence just like you would for your dog. And it will tone, and when they get closer to the edge, if they get too close, it'll give them a little shock to encourage them to go the other way. This also lets us even rotate the cows within larger pastures or exclude them. If we don't want them to be in a wetland or something like that, we can essentially digitally fence that off without having to put in a hard fence to keep them out of something we don't want them to be in. So we're working, again, science is a big part of what we do there. This is one of the professors that we're working with on this project, Dr. Lydia O'Halloran from Clemson, and one of her graduate students. In this project, they're looking at soil health and soil nutrients and moisture and things of that nature. This is really interesting. This little thing looks like an R2D2. It's actually sucking carbon out of the soil so that we can look at carbon concentrations in the soil in the grazed area and in the ungrazed area. We of course did all this with controls and experimental units that are paired so that we can actually measure those effects. And this is just the tip of the iceberg from our research standpoint. But what are we ultimately hoping to see? And there's more research, again, I'll talk a little bit about some of those pieces, but we're approaching this from a variety of angles. But what are we trying to produce here through this project? Well, one thing we want to produce is landscape health. We're trying to improve the overall health of the ecosystem through grazing. And this is from our friends in Europe. This is one of their quotes. But a lot of what we're trying to produce is manure. This manure and those dung beetles that you see in that picture are churning that manure. They're digesting that manure. They're converting it into things that are being pulled down into the roots of the plants. This is producing an ecosystem response, forbs, seeds, flowers, things of that nature. I'll hit on that several times because that's really very much what we're trying to do here. We want our cows to work like tractors. One of the neat things about cows, you think about how they're built. They are pooping out fertilizer, and then they have these sharp hooves. And they are, with those sharp hooves, working that into the soil. It's just the same as if you're working in your garden and you bought a bag of manure and then you tilt it into your soil. The cows are doing that all naturally. And again, when we think about this is important that we have cows producing this service for us because landowners are the driver. This is from the west, but I think the same applies to the east. Landowners are the drivers of conservation. If we can have the cows doing a lot of that work and provide them an alternative revenue stream to incentivize them to do the work, that's going to produce better conservation outcomes. Private ownership is important. Private ownership drives conservation. Things like beef brush and bobwhite. So this is a more established system in other parts of the country. This is one of the when I was doing my quail work when I was in Texas. This was kind of one of the bibles of quail work, was the interface between cattle and quail. And again, quail being a surrogate for the whole suite of grassland species. But this is the type of thing we want to do. Something with the Southeast. This is a different system than Texas. We can borrow some things from this book. The new author of that was actually one of my lab mates, Fidel Hernandez, was when I was doing my master's degree. It was kind of fun to see he'd rewritten the book. But we want to produce something like this, ultimately, that can be a guide to southeastern landowners, again, in a very different ecosystem than they have in Texas. We want to produce fields like this. So the classic image you see in paintings, when you're looking at a painting of a classic quail scene of the big pines with the big monoculture of broom straw, broom sedge underneath it, is actually pretty crummy quail habitat. It's what it always looks like in the paintings, but quail don't like big thickets of monocultured grass. They like this. They like flowers. They like openings. Those flowers produce seeds. Those flowers produce insects. And again, quail, I'm using quail as my surrogate for the whole ecosystem, responds better to those things. We want to see landscapes that look like this. We want to see pollinators pollinating those flowers that are growing up. We call them forbs, which are basically just flowering plants. This is when I was talking about the control and experiment thing. So imagine that you are a grassland bird that needs open understory, which again, most of them do, and that is what you're staring at. You're a quail chick, you're a turkey colt, or you're a shrike that's trying to forage, and you're trying to get through that wall of grass. That was one side of the road on our control site. That's the other side of the road on our treatment site. So with even just a handful of cattle, you see a dramatic difference in the accessibility of open ground, which is very important, again, from shrikes to quail to all sorts of birds and other species. My wildlife scientist put this one together for me. That we're starting to get our first sets of results back. So this is our first, some of the first things we can actually show quantitatively about that response. Basically, again, imagine you're a mama turkey that's walking through this landscape. On the left side, that's what she would be seeing, basically a wall that she'd be trying to navigate through with her colts. On the right side, that's the grazed area. So we've actually reduced the visual obstruction by about 50%, and similar with the just biomass of vegetation on the landscape. And this again affects everything, and this isn't just for game species. Red cockaded woodpeckers, other species that need these savanna-esque ecosystems need that open understory. So we're trying to do something that will benefit really the entire suite of species that we have there. So we get into questions about this. What are we trying to do? And then what are some of the challenges? What are some of the things you may have heard about cattle that are negative? And those things are not invalid. Cattle and greenhouse gases are real. However, they're not necessarily what you think they are depending on how you graze them. Why are cows bad for the environment? What can you do? Well, the answer is you can graze them properly. Cows are bad for the environment if you put them in a giant feedlot and stuff them full of corn, which makes them sick and makes them produce methane. This is one of the gentlemen that we actually consulted with when we were beginning this whole process. If you ever go to Publix, he was the first guy to sell grass-fed beef at Publix. He wrote a wonderful book called A Bold Return to Giving a Damn, which is about taking his family cattle operation from an industrial model back to a regenerative model, which is more of what his grandfather did. I recommend, by the way, if you ever get this book, to listen to it. He has the most spectacular Southern accent you've ever heard in your life. And it's his life story, and it's just much more animated to listen to than to actually read. But to the point about climate health, he's demonstrated, and through research that he has had done on his property, that his cattle are carbon negative. And this is at a much denser scale than we're talking about here. Similarly, our colleagues in Europe that are rewilding, this was with bison, but they demonstrated that 170 bison were taking the equivalent of 54,000 tons of carbon off of the landscape per year. So why is this happening? So the biomass that is being consumed, being pooped out, worked through the dung beetles, and then absorbed into the root systems of long-lived grasses and things like longleaf pine, is now sequestered underground. It's not being digested by the microbes and going up into the air, and it's also not being burned off and going up into the air. So we haven't demonstrated that yet with ours, but I'm quite confident that these models are actually doing things even more progressively than those folks are in most cases. So I'm quite confident ours are carbon negative as well. Fuel load and burn interval reduction. One of our colleagues we worked with on this as well about, there's always the idea cows are expensive. Why would you get into the cattle business? It's expensive. So he actually has modeled on his property. He has a much larger herd than we do. He's also running piney woods, and it's not far from us. That he's reduced his cost of managing that property by letting his cows be his lawnmowers and also reducing his burn interval. So he doesn't have to burn as much. Burning doesn't go away. It doesn't exit the equation. But you don't burn as much, and you don't put as much ash and smoke and things like that into the air if you're grazing it. And that also reduces the probability of something like this, of a wildfire being so intense that it gets away from you and causes damage. And so we want to see burns like this. We don't want to see burns like the one we saw in the foreground. And the cows are a big part of being able to do that safely and consistently. Animal health. So we all care, I would imagine everyone here has some care about whether animals are living good lives and are being treated well. This is a traditional feedlot. This is where most of our beef comes from. These animals are, I would argue, probably not in their best state while they're in a situation like this. Compare that to our animals. So our animals are living on the landscape, doing what they want to do, eating what they want to eat, living their best lives. Eventually, some of them will become beef. That's part of the model, that we're trying to do something that will produce protein and revenue. But they are living happy, healthy lives with minimal intervention the entire time that they're out on that landscape. They're not being confined. They're not being pumped full of antibiotics. They're not being essentially abused, in my opinion, until they are eventually harvested. Agricultural health. So when we think about agriculture, so these animals are, again, these are ancient animals. This is an endangered breed. There's about 3,000 piney woods in the world. Currently in the Lowcountry, if you could ask 5 years ago, you'd say about 0% of the piney woods herd was in the Lowcountry. We now have over 10%. And I think we're on the upswing on that. I think we will be known as the piney woods capital in a few years if everything comes together as I'm hoping. Anybody know what anything about this seed bank in Svalbard, Norway? Okay, so if you're not familiar with it, there is a big vault in Norway, which is basically in a giant freezer of its own climatic making, where they take seeds to try to preserve the genetic diversity of crops, because having a crop that is not genetically diverse is obviously subject to all sorts of diseases and issues, and not also being able to change as conditions change. Think about our cows. Our cows are a 500 years of evolution that are genetically predisposed and built to function in hot, wet environments. What's the world turning into? A hotter, wetter environment. And all of the monoculture beef out there is not ready for the waterfowl. So I think of our cows as being in a way a seed bank of an important repository of ancient genes that have been built to work in the system and the climate that we're moving into. Soil health. As again I mentioned, one of our graduate students is working on soil health. You can already, I don't have any of the quantitative stuff yet. Lydia hasn't sent me all of her data. Her students are not finished yet. But you can measure, and it's already demonstrable, that the soil is richer, it is more full of various nutrients that will ultimately create, again, a better biological response and enrich that ecosystem. Again, from that processing of the biomass and then working it into the soil. Human health. So again, people are a big part of this whole equation. When you compare grain-fed and forage-fed cows, very simply, you look through those. We have fewer calories in forage-fed. We have fewer saturated fat. We have much more omega-3s. Kind of when you think about egg yolks, a chicken that's been out eating wild forage has those deep, rich yellow yolks that are full of all of those things that we need. Again, it's the reason you get the washed out yolks. And you can see it in the beef. The beef, when you look at it side by side, our beef is deep, rich, red colored. You look at it, I was actually cooked some a couple of days ago, and if we do comparisons, that's another story I can tell you. If anybody has questions about beef, I'll tell you more about that part. But it's visible how much richer the beef is. The omega-3 ratio is better. CLA ratio is better. It's basically much better for you. Part of the reason why beef gets a bad rap for being unhealthy is that the fatty acid profiles of grain-fed beef are not good for you. The fatty acid profiles of forage-fed beef are good for you. So it has human health implications, as well as not being pumped full of antibiotics and all those other things, which talk about antibiotics. We don't put antibiotics into our cows. That is actually part of the industrial model. The antibiotics actually help them put on weight faster. Help is probably not the right word, but they actually do cause them to put on weight faster. That also is a big issue with things like antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Rural and economic health. This is going a little bit back to what I mentioned earlier about sort of the all-American concept of making your own living off of a plot of land and the value of working in the soil, which I think is something that we're increasingly missing. Most of America's rural areas are doomed to decline. You look at somebody like what Will did at White Oak Pastures. He has completely revitalized an entire county through his regenerative grazing program. He is the largest employer in that county, which was actually statistically the poorest county in America when he started. And now he is employing around 100 people. He has $150,000 in payroll he cuts every 2 weeks, pumping all of that into that economy. And we also want to see things like this. These are some of our neighbors right up the road, up near Yenisei. Now again, this is a small family farm. These folks moved here from out of state. They started a little farm. They're trying to do regenerative agriculture. We want to be a resource for them. We want to help them get off the ground, to help build that infrastructure, to do things the right way, and to raise families in that way again. In something that, as I mentioned, ultimately comes back to a lot of what we do in the moors, which is wildlife health. So I've talked about quail as being kind of our flagship species, something that's, I think, easy to wrap your minds around. But what we're doing here is improving habitat for things like gopher tortoises. Again, gopher tortoises don't like giant thickets of monocultured grass and certainly don't like loblolly plantations. Gopher frogs, same thing. Log-red shrikes, all of these things are species that are imperiled or in decline, and the type of ecosystems that we're creating with the cattle are the type of things that these animals need. And so with that, I will wrap up here real briefly. I just wanted to say, if you're interested in learning more about what we do out there, we have, that's my daughter, that's my closing shot. We're at the very beginning of this whole project. This is the birth of the Eco-Pasture Initiative. We're only 2 years into this, so this has a lot more to come. If you're interested in learning more about it, we have a whole series of tours that we do out there. These are all free. We try to do everything that we can. The Coastal Kids program is free to those children, which is, again, thanks to the support of the people in this room and people at the moors. We also have these tours that we have up there, the Eco-Pasture Initiative tour, which we just did a couple weeks ago. These are all free as well. So if you want to come out and learn more about these things, or if you know people that would like to learn more about these things, I definitely would encourage you to look into what we're doing here. This is our QR code for our mailing list. This is where we announce all the stuff that's coming. So if you're interested in learning more, definitely scan the QR code, sign up for our mailing list, and you'll see all the things we got coming down the pike. And with that, happy to answer any questions. Yes, sir.
I realized you were right at the front end of this process, but have you seen any effect on the air of other mammals or birds that you could tell us about?
So we're, as you mentioned, we're kind of in the early innings of what we're doing right now. We have a bird monitoring program that we've started of doing point counts. I think we actually need to refine how we're doing that a little bit more. So we don't have any real quantitative measurements of how those things are interacting. So the answer right now is we don't have a good answer to that yet, but we are building that data set up so that we'll be able to measure that more. Part of this is a scale question. We talk about things like birds. We've only started with a few hundred acres. We'll need to increase that acreage to the point that we can affect a whole home range of a bird or birds to be able to see a strong effect. I will say, just anecdotally, we don't have wild quail at the moors really in any numbers anymore. We have not heard a quail on the property since I've been there in 4 years, except once. And that was the year we started the grazing. We actually had a bobwhiting from the cattle pasture about a year after we put him in there. It's an N of 1, it's not a significant study, but it was one of those moments where you thought this might actually be starting to work. Yes, ma'am.
I would imagine that cattle have large economic factor. Did you consider doing bison or a native species?
Yeah, the bison, it's funny, I almost stuck this in there because I've gotten asked about bison quite a bit. I think the bison concept is a good concept. Bison are really hard to contain. And I've got a great video of a bison ripping a fence apart that I need to start putting in stuff. They are very challenging to maintain, and so when we were building this model, we wanted something that could be replicable, because again, we're trying to have something we can export. This isn't just meant for us. And the idea of bison is not going to get picked up by a lot of the small farms and landowners around us, but I think that the concept is very valid. It's just they're challenging to work with. Yes, sir?
Something in the middle, beefalo.
Beefalo, yes, yeah, which all bison to some extent are nowadays. They've all got some cow genes in them. But yes, and this is why we went with the cattle, because we felt like these were animals, again, being docile animals that we could work with safely, and again, we could export that we work with safely, was really what we were trying to get out there. But I think the bison idea has definitely got validity. I don't know that it's the right answer on this landscape at the scale that we're working at. Yes, ma'am.
Right, so you talked about Clemson doing its study of the microbiome and the richness of the soil.
Mm-hmm.
Have you actually tabulated the more diverse grasses that are growing? And have you considered the thought that it may change
Yes.
the actual ecosystem of New Moors, and then you will have to address what comes with that?
Absolutely. So we're monitoring all that. So the just sort of very basic graph that you saw there of just obstruction. We're actually doing whole surveys of all the different plants and their prevalence on the landscape, again with controls and experiments, so we can take out the noise from just climatic and other shifts. But we have experimental plots, those little things you saw the kids carrying. We're doing those with plants on the same landscape. So we don't have a lot of that tabulated. Again, we're very early innings right now, but we're going to be monitoring that through time. One of the new things I'm actually really, got me on a tangent here, but one of the things I'm really excited about, we've got an area that we're going to be adding cattle to in 2 years that we're actually clearing probably literally as we speak. We're removing a loblolly stand that was about 10 years old, or actually probably about 8 years old. And we're going to completely clear that and then plant it with longleaf. And the idea is, and then put cattle on it almost immediately, which has never been done to my knowledge before, and to see what the survival rates and growth rates of those longleaf are. In the grazed areas, again, we're going to partition this whole area over time. And this will outlive me. This is going to be a 50-year experiment because we're going to have to see it in longleaf grow very slowly. But we're getting that in motion right now, so that'll be a future chapter. But I'll have more data on all that stuff. If you come see me, I'll come back. If Andy invites me back, I'll come back in a couple of years and I'll have a little more results to be able to share. Yes, ma'am.
So you're wanting to export this idea to smaller farmers. What is the minimum amount of acreage a farmer needs to have in order to do this?
That's a great question. So we're stocking at about a 10 acre per cow ratio right now. I think we could be a little denser than that. We are quite rich here, and the biomass grows quickly here, more so than in some other places. But that's part of what we're trying to dial in, is being able to really have a prescriptive answer to that. Again, that's something that's not too far in the future, but we're not quite there where we can say you have a 50-acre farm, you can have 8 animals on that, and that's the right number for what we're talking about doing here. But that's definitely where we want to go with it, and hopefully in a year or two we'll be able to have more of a prescription for it. Yes, ma'am.
Have the cattle reproduced so you have more?
Oh, yes, we do. And actually, so with me, I will back up. So this lovely gentleman there on the far side is Hank. That is our bull. Hank the bull, we've been doing everything au natural. We brought Hank onto the property about a year after we started. Hank seemed to enjoy his work. And we've had a whole crop of calves. We had one born about a week ago. So we've got a whole crop of calves that have been actually born on the property. That was a big watershed moment, and the first one that was both conceived and born on the property was about a year ago. So we're going to be rotating Hank out. His tenure is over, and we're going to get a new set of genes in and trade him out for a new bull.
Andrew, thank you so much.
You are so welcome.